Elliot Ness was untouchable. That's what everyone said. The man who took down Al Capone, the incorruptible federal agent who'd become America's most famous lawman, arrived in Cleveland, Ohio in 1935 as the city's new safety director with a reputation that preceded him like thunder. He was 32 years old, handsome, brilliant, and utterly confident in his abilities. Cleveland welcomed him as a savior, a man who would clean up their corrupt police force and bring order to a city drowning in crime and economic depression. But Cleveland had a secret waiting for Elliot Ness, a nightmare that would haunt him for the rest of his life. A killer so cunning, so brutal, so careful that even the great Elliot Ness couldn't catch him. This is the story of the Cleveland torso murderer, a serial killer who dismembered at least 12 victims, possibly more, and was never caught. This is the story of how America's greatest detective met his match in a killer who understood one simple truth. The dead can't talk, but dismembered bodies scream in their silence. And this nightmare began on a warm September afternoon in 1935, in a place called Kingsbury Run, where two boys would make a discovery that would unleash one of the most terrifying murder investigations in American history. September 23, 1935, two teenage boys, James Wagner and Peter Costura, were walking through Kingsbury Run, a Depression-era shantytown built in a ravine on Cleveland's east side. It was where the homeless lived in makeshift shelters, where the unemployed gathered around barrel fires, where decent people didn't go after dark. The boys were looking for scrap metal they could sell. Instead, they found a body, or rather what was left of one. At the bottom of a gully, partially hidden by weeds, lay a nude male torso. No head, no arms, no legs, just a torso, the cuts so precise they looked almost surgical. The body had been dead for weeks, possibly months, the flesh partially decomposed and preserved by chemicals that would later be identified as some kind of preservative. The boys ran screaming to find a police officer. Within hours, Kingsbury Run was swarming with cops. And that's when they found the second body. 30 feet away, buried in a shallow grave, was another torso. This one was headless as well, the limbs removed with the same disturbing precision. Two bodies, both male. Both dismembered with what the coroner would later describe as expert anatomical knowledge. Both completely unidentifiable without heads or fingerprints. The press went wild. Headlines screamed about the mad butcher of Kingsbury Run. But the police had nothing. No witnesses, no suspects, no leads. Just two nameless victims and a killer who knew exactly how to make identification impossible. When Elliot Ness arrived in Cleveland 2 months after those first bodies were found, the case was already going cold. The police had investigated, interviewed dozens of shantytown residents, searched the area thoroughly, and come up empty. Ness had bigger concerns. He was busy cleaning house at the police department, firing corrupt cops, reorganizing the force, making enemies among the old guard who resented this young outsider telling them how to do their jobs. The torso murders were a local matter, a couple of dead transients, probably killed by another vagrant in some dispute that would never be solved. That's what Ness thought initially. That's what everyone thought. They were wrong. On January 26, 1936, 4 months after the first discovery, a woman walking her dog in a lot behind a butcher shop found a burlap bag. Inside were parts of a woman, an arm, torso, portions of legs, all carefully wrapped, all showing those same precise cuts. 2 weeks later, more parts were found scattered around the area. The head was discovered in a different location, partially buried. When they finally assembled all the pieces, they realized this was victim number 3. A woman this time, estimated to be around 40 years old. And then the killer went quiet. Months passed. Ness focused on his war against organized crime and police corruption. But the investigation into the torso murders remained open, the files sitting on a detective's desk like a ticking time bomb, because the killer wasn't done. He was just getting started. June 5, 1936. A teenage boy hunting for minnows near Kingsbury Run found a pair of pants rolled into a bundle. Inside was a severed head. It belonged to a man, and the features were intact enough for identification. Finally, after 3 victims, they had a name: Edward Andrassy, a 28-year-old hospital orderly with a wife and a history of petty crime. The rest of Andrassy's body was found nearby, dismembered in the now familiar pattern. But there was something different about this victim. His genital area had been mutilated after death, and chemical tests showed he'd been alive when the dismemberment began. He'd been tortured. 3 days later, another body surfaced. This time just a torso and upper legs, found floating in Kingsbury Run's stagnant pools. Victim number 5, male, never identified, dismembered with the same precision. The press was in a frenzy. The mayor was demanding answers. And Eliot Ness, the famous crime fighter, found himself facing a challenge unlike any he'd encountered before. This wasn't like catching bootleggers or corrupt cops. This was hunting a ghost, a killer who left no witnesses, no evidence, nothing but silent, dismembered corpses that couldn't tell their stories. Ness assembled a special task force. Detectives Peter Marilow and Martin Zalewski were assigned to the case full-time. They began reviewing the evidence, looking for patterns, trying to build a profile of the killer. What they discovered was chilling. Detective Marilow was a bulldog of a cop, obsessive and relentless. He spent months studying the autopsy reports, visiting the dump sites, trying to understand the mind of the killer. What he found suggested a methodical, intelligent predator operating with disturbing precision. First, the killer selected victims from society's margins. Transients, prostitutes, people who wouldn't be immediately missed, people whose disappearance might never be reported. Second, the murders took place somewhere private, somewhere the killer could work undisturbed. The bodies were killed elsewhere and dumped in Kingsbury Run, never murdered at the location where they were found. Third, the dismemberment showed anatomical knowledge. The cuts were made at joints, the organs removed with care, the blood drained completely. Someone who knew human anatomy, possibly a doctor or butcher or someone with medical training. Fourth, the killer used chemicals to preserve some bodies, delaying decomposition and making time of death harder to determine. This suggested planning, preparation, access to preservatives. Fifth, and most disturbing, there were signs of torture on some victims. The killer didn't just murder them. He kept them alive, working on them, taking his time. Detective Zalewski focused on the psychological profile. What kind of person could do this? The answer was terrifying. Someone intelligent, organized, patient, and completely devoid of empathy. Someone who viewed human beings as objects, as materials to work with. Someone who was probably living a normal life, holding down a job, interacting with neighbors, while secretly conducting these horrific murders in some hidden location. Where are you watching from? What time is it where you are? Drop a comment and let me know. If you're fascinated by unsolved mysteries and true crime, hit that subscribe button, smash the like, and turn on notifications because this case gets even darker. Now let's continue. July 22nd, 1936. Another victim. This time in the Big Creek area, miles from Kingsbury Run. A decapitated male torso, partially buried. Victim number 6. September 10th, 1936. The severed upper torso of a man was found in Kingsbury Run. Victim number 7. February 23rd, 1937. The upper part of a female torso washed up on the beach at East 30th Street. Victim number 8. A woman, dismembered with the same precision, dumped in Lake Erie. June 6, 1937. The decomposed lower torso of a woman floated to the surface under the Lorraine Carnegie Bridge. Victim number 9. The city was in panic. Cleveland's newspapers ran daily updates. Citizens were terrified. The shantytown residents of Kingsbury Run lived in constant fear, sleeping in groups, arming themselves with whatever they could find. And Eliot Ness was under enormous pressure. The man who'd taken down Capone couldn't catch a killer operating in his own city. The press started to turn on him. Editorial cartoons showed Ness chasing his own shadow while bodies piled up. Political enemies questioned whether the famous G-Man was out of his depth. But Ness didn't give up. He threw everything at the investigation. He ordered police to raid every shantytown, interview every transient, search every abandoned building in a 10-mile radius. He brought in experts from across the country. He personally visited crime scenes, studied the evidence, tried to find the connection. Nothing worked. The killer was too careful, too smart, too invisible. And then, on July 6, 1937, something changed. The killer made his first mistake. A woman stumbled into a police station, hysterical and barely coherent. Her name was later withheld from public records, but her story was documented in detail by investigators. She claimed she'd been picked up by a man offering her money and a place to stay. She was homeless, desperate, and she accepted. He took her to a building, she couldn't remember where. She'd been drinking heavily. The man gave her more alcohol, and that's when things got strange. She woke up on a table. She was naked. The man was there, wearing a butcher's apron, sharpening knives. He had a doctor's bag filled with surgical instruments. She screamed and fought. Somehow, in the struggle, she managed to break free and run. She fled through a door, downstairs, into the street, naked and terrified. She ran until she found the police station. The police tried to get her to lead them back to the location, but she couldn't remember. The alcohol, the trauma, the terror had wiped her memory. She could only describe the man in vague terms. Middle-aged, strong, well-dressed, spoke well, had soft hands. Detective Marillo believed her story completely. This fit the profile. The killer had kept her alive, prepared to work on her, and she'd escaped only through sheer luck. But without a location or a better description, they still had nothing solid. The woman disappeared shortly after giving her statement, probably too terrified to stay in Cleveland. She was never heard from again, and the killer, having lost a victim for the first time, seemed to grow even bolder. August 16, 1937. 2 burlap bags were found in the Cuyahoga River. Inside were the remains of victim number 10, a male, dismembered with increasing brutality. The coroner noted that the victim had been alive during the dismemberment. He'd been conscious, aware, suffering. April 8, 1938. A woman's leg was found floating in the river. Over the next few days, more parts surfaced. Victim number 11. A woman, her body scattered across multiple locations as if the killer was playing a game, seeing how far he could spread the evidence. What terrified investigators was the increasing frequency and the growing brutality. The killer was escalating. The torture was becoming more extreme, the dismemberment more violent, and there was something else. The dump sites were getting closer to the heart of the city, closer to wealthy neighborhoods, as if the killer was taunting the police, saying, "I can do this anywhere, and you still can't stop me." Elliot Ness was consumed by the case now. It had become personal. His reputation, his entire career, was being measured against his failure to catch this killer. He worked 18-hour days, chain-smoking and barely sleeping, reviewing evidence, chasing leads that went nowhere. He brought in psychologists to profile the killer. He consulted with FBI agents, with forensic experts, with anyone who might offer a fresh perspective. And then Ness did something desperate, something controversial, something that would haunt his legacy for the rest of his life. August 18, 1938. At 2 a.m., Elliot Ness led a massive police raid on the shantytown in Kingsbury Run. Over 100 officers descended on the area with torches and bulldozers. They arrested every transient they found, over 60 people. They burned the shanties to the ground, destroying the entire settlement. Ness's reasoning was twofold. First, he believed the killer was finding victims in the shantytown, and by dispersing the population, he'd remove the hunting ground. Second, he hoped the raid would shake something loose, that someone might have seen something or know something, and the shock of the raid would make them talk. The raid was brutal and widely condemned. Civil rights groups protested. The press called it a violation of the poor's basic rights. The homeless had nowhere to go, scattered across the city, many arrested on vagrancy charges. And the worst part? It didn't work. The killer didn't stop. On August 16, 1939, exactly 1 year after the raid, the dismembered remains of victim number 12 were found. The torso was discovered in a dump near East 9th Street. The legs were found 10 miles away. The head was never recovered. It was as if the killer was making a point. You can burn down shanties. You can arrest transients. But you can't touch me. I'm still here. I'm still working. And you're still helpless to stop me. Eliot Ness's career in Cleveland was effectively over. Though he remained safety director until 1942, his reputation never recovered from the Torso murders. The man who'd taken down Capone had been defeated by a killer who remained a shadow. But Ness never stopped investigating, even after he left office. In his private notes, discovered after his death, he identified a prime suspect, Dr. Francis Edward Sweeney. Sweeney was a surgeon who'd served in World War I and had performed amputations in field hospitals. He came from a prominent Cleveland family, had the medical knowledge to perform the dismemberments, and lived near several of the dump sites. But here's what made him truly suspicious. Sweeney had a history of violent behavior, alcoholism, and had been institutionalized multiple times for mental health issues. His ex-wife had reported that he'd threatened her with knives and talked about cutting people up. He lived in a building that had been investigated as a possible murder site. And he knew Eliot Ness personally. They'd met socially before the murders began. In 1938, Ness had Sweeney brought in for questioning. According to Ness's notes, he subjected Sweeney to a polygraph test that lasted for days, one of the longest interrogations in Cleveland history. Sweeney allegedly failed the polygraph repeatedly when asked about the murders. But here's the problem. Sweeney's family was politically connected. His cousin was a congressman. There was no physical evidence linking him to any crime scene, and polygraph results weren't admissible in court. Ness couldn't arrest him, couldn't charge him, couldn't publicly accuse him without proof. What Ness could do, allegedly, was make a deal. Shortly after the interrogation, Sweeney voluntarily committed himself to a veterans hospital, a mental institution where he would remain for the rest of his life. And the murders stopped. No more Torso victims were found in Cleveland after 1938. Coincidence? Or confession through action? Make sure you're subscribed because we're about to dive into the theories and the evidence that still haunts investigators today. Hit that like button and turn on notifications so you don't miss what comes next. Detective Merillo, who continued investigating the case even after Ness left Cleveland, was convinced Sweeney was the killer. The evidence, while circumstantial, was compelling. Sweeney lived at 2014 Scoville Avenue, right next to Kingsbury Run. He had access to a private lab where he could work undisturbed. As a doctor, he had both the anatomical knowledge and the tools needed for the dismemberments. He fit the psychological profile: intelligent, organized, able to maintain a normal facade while harboring violent impulses. His medical discharge papers from World War I indicated he'd suffered from what was then called shell shock, now known as PTSD, and had shown signs of psychopathy. Former colleagues reported that Sweeney had an unusual fascination with human anatomy, that he'd made inappropriate comments about dissection and cutting. One nurse claimed he'd once joked about practicing on cadavers in ways that weren't medically necessary. His timeline matched perfectly. He was in Cleveland for all 12 murders. After his institutionalization in 1938, the Cleveland murders stopped completely. Some investigators believed the murder count was actually higher. There were similar unsolved dismemberment cases in Pennsylvania and Ohio dating back to 1923 and continuing into the 1950s. All bore the same hallmarks: precise cuts, complete dismemberment, victims from marginalized populations. Sweeney had moved around during those years, and his whereabouts often coincided with the locations and timing of these other murders. But without concrete evidence, without a confession, without physical proof linking him to even one victim, Sweeney remained only a suspect. A very likely suspect, but still just a theory. Not everyone believed Sweeney was the killer. Over the decades, other theories emerged. Some investigators thought there were actually two killers working independently or together. The variation in dump sites, the differences in preservation methods, the inconsistencies in the mutilation patterns suggested possibly different perpetrators. Others pointed to Frank Dolezal, a bricklayer who was arrested in 1939 after one victim, Flo Polillo, was found to have lived in his building. Dolezal was interrogated brutally by police and allegedly confessed, though he later recanted. He died in jail under suspicious circumstances, possibly murdered, possibly suicide, before trial. But the murders continued after his death, suggesting he wasn't the killer or wasn't the only one. Some theorists believed the killer might have been a woman. The precision of the cuts, the seeming lack of sexual assault on many victims, and the ability to lure victims without suspicion could point to a female killer, possibly a nurse or midwife. There was even a theory that the killer was a mortician or someone who worked in the death industry, someone who had regular access to bodies and embalming chemicals, someone for whom dismemberment was a professional skill. And then there were the truly wild theories, that it was a satanic cult, that it was organized crime sending messages through the bodies, that it was a conspiracy involving multiple people in positions of power. But the simplest explanation remained the most likely. One killer, someone with medical knowledge, someone organized and patient, someone who stopped when the heat got too intense, someone exactly like Dr. Francis Sweeney. Eliot Ness left Cleveland in 1942, his reputation tarnished by both the unsolved torso murders and a drunk driving accident that had injured a young man. He moved to Washington, D.C., then to Pennsylvania, working various security jobs, never again achieving the fame and success he'd had as a young agent. But he never stopped thinking about the torso murders. Friends and colleagues reported that Ness was haunted by the case, that he'd bring it up at parties, that he kept files and notes, that he continued to follow any news about similar murders. In his later years, broke and struggling with alcoholism, Ness began working on his memoirs with writer Oscar Fraley. The book, The Untouchables, focused on his glory days fighting Capone. But in private conversations, Fraley said Ness talked constantly about the torso murders, about his certainty that Sweeney was the killer, about his frustration at never being able to prove it. Ness allegedly told Fraley that the torso case was his greatest failure, that it overshadowed everything else he'd accomplished, that he'd trade all his fame from the Capone case to have caught the Cleveland killer. In 1957, Eliot Ness died of a heart attack at age 54. He was broke, largely forgotten, his career seen as a cautionary tale of early promise gone wrong. The Untouchables was published after his death and became a bestseller, eventually spawning the famous TV show and movie. But Ness never lived to see his rehabilitation, never saw the public remember him as a hero again. And he died knowing that the Cleveland torso murderer had beaten him, had escaped justice, had won. Dr. Francis Edward Sweeney lived in mental institutions from 1938 until his death in 1964. During those 26 years, he was a model patient by most accounts, quiet and cooperative, taking his medications, attending therapy sessions. But there were disturbing incidents. Nurses reported finding drawings in his room, sketches of human bodies with dotted lines showing where limbs would be separated, like a butcher's chart. He allegedly had nightmares where he'd wake up screaming about the work and finishing the job. On several occasions, he tried to send letters to Eliot Ness. The hospital intercepted most of them, but a few got through. The contents were never fully disclosed, but people who saw them described them as rambling, sometimes coherent accusations of police harassment, other times bizarre admissions cloaked in metaphor and medical terminology. In one letter that survived in police files, Sweeney wrote, "You think you know what I am. You think you understand the work. But you're just a cop, and cops see blood and screaming. You don't see the art. You don't see the transformation. The body is just meat, Ness. Just meat that needs to be properly prepared." Whether this was the rambling of a mentally ill man or the veiled confession of a serial killer remains debated. Sweeney died in 1964 at age 70. His death was barely noted in the newspapers. No one came to his funeral except a nephew who paid for a simple burial. His medical records and personal effects were sealed by his family and have never been released publicly. Whatever secrets Francis Sweeney held, whatever truth about those 12 dismembered bodies might have been in his mind, died with him. Lost in the horror and the investigation and the hunt for the killer are the victims themselves. Most were never identified. They remain Jane and John Does, buried in unmarked graves or potter's fields, their names forgotten. their stories untold. But some we know. Edward Andersey, the hospital orderly, had a wife who mourned him, who insisted he wasn't the criminal the press made him out to be, who said he was just a man trying to survive in hard times. Flo Polillo was a 50-year-old waitress and part-time sex worker, a woman with a hard life but friends who loved her, who said she had a big heart and helped other struggling women. Rose Wallace was identified from her dental records. She was 40, a mother who'd fallen on hard times after her husband left, who'd ended up on the streets, who'd been trying to get her life together when she disappeared. These were real people. They had families, friends, lives that mattered. They weren't just victims of a serial killer. They were human beings who deserved better than to be dismembered and dumped like garbage in a ravine. The tragedy of the Cleveland torso murders isn't just that the killer was never caught. It's that society had already made these people invisible before they died. They were poor, they were transient, they were considered disposable. The killer simply acted on what society already believed, that some lives don't matter. That's the real horror. Not just the brutal murders, but the fact that for so long, people didn't care because the victims were just homeless people, just prostitutes, just the people society had already decided to ignore. The case remains officially unsolved. The Cleveland Police Department still maintains an open file on the torso murders. In the 1990s, advances in forensic technology gave investigators new hope. DNA testing, which didn't exist in the 1930s, could potentially link evidence from different crime scenes, or even identify some of the unknown victims if their descendants could be found. But there was a problem. Most of the physical evidence was lost or degraded. The remains had been buried for decades. The crime scene evidence from the 1930s had been stored improperly or thrown away. What little DNA might have been recovered was contaminated beyond use. In 2001, a group of modern forensic experts and historians conducted a comprehensive review of all available evidence. They used geographic profiling to map the dump sites and predict where the killer likely lived or worked. Their analysis pointed to the same area where Dr. Sweeney had his residence and practice. They reviewed the autopsy reports with modern understanding of serial killer behavior and concluded that the dismemberment pattern was consistent with someone who had both surgical training and a compulsive need for control and domination. They noted that several victims showed signs of being kept alive during the early stages of dismemberment, suggesting the killer derived pleasure from their suffering, a classic signature of sadistic serial killers. Their conclusion? Dr. Francis Edward Sweeney remained the most likely suspect, with a probability of over 85% based on available evidence. But probability isn't proof. And without proof, the case remains unsolved. Chapter 17. The Copycat Question. One disturbing aspect of the case is the possibility of copycat killings, or even that the original killer continued his work elsewhere. Between 1940 and 1950, there were at least 6 similar cases in Pennsylvania, 3 in Ohio outside Cleveland, and 2 in Illinois. All involved dismemberment with surgical precision. All victims were from marginalized populations. All remained unsolved. Were these the work of the Cleveland killer who'd simply relocated? Or were they copycats, other killers inspired by the publicity of the original case? Some of these cases were eerily similar. In 1940, 3 dismembered bodies were found in railroad boxcars in Pennsylvania. The cuts were identical to the Cleveland pattern. The victims were transients. No one was ever charged. In 1942, 2 torsos were found in the New Castle, Pennsylvania area. Again, surgical precision, complete dismemberment, no identification possible. Some investigators theorized that if Sweeney was the killer, his institutionalization wasn't as restrictive as believed. Mental hospitals in that era had minimal security for voluntary patients. Sweeney could have potentially left the facility during his good periods, committed murders, and returned. Others believed there might have been a student or protege, someone who'd learned the technique from the original killer and continued the work. The most chilling theory? That the Cleveland torso murderer was just one example of a type of killer that's more common than we'd like to believe. Someone who targets society's invisible people, who has the skills and knowledge to make identification nearly impossible, and who operates with such care and patience that they're never caught. How many other such killers might there have been throughout history? Their crimes attributed to accidents or misadventures, their victims too marginalized for society to notice or care. The Torso murders defined Elliot Ness's legacy in ways the Capone case never did. Taking down a famous gangster made Ness a hero. Failing to catch a serial killer made him human, fallible, tragic. Historians debate whether Ness handled the case well. Some argue he did everything possible with the tools and knowledge available at the time. Serial killer profiling didn't exist yet. Forensic science was primitive. The killer was careful to an extraordinary degree. Others criticize his tactics, particularly the Shantytown raid, as heavy-handed and ultimately counterproductive. They argue he let ego and desperation drive his decisions, that he became too personally invested to think clearly. But what's undeniable is that the case haunted Ness. It transformed him from a confident crusader into a more complex, troubled figure. The man who thought he could solve any case learned there are some puzzles that don't have solutions, some evil that escapes justice. In a way, the Torso murders were a preview of the modern understanding of serial killers. These aren't movie villains or comic book monsters. They're real people who can blend into society, who can be intelligent and careful, who can operate for years without being caught. The Cleveland case was one of the first to demonstrate that even the best investigators can be completely stymied by a killer who understands how to remain invisible. Ness's failure, if we can call it that, was perhaps inevitable. He was fighting a type of criminal that law enforcement didn't yet understand, using methods that weren't yet developed, against a killer who was ahead of his time in his sophistication. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. Hit that like button and turn on notifications for more deep dives into history's darkest mysteries. We're almost at the end, but the final chapters hold some surprising revelations. Even after nearly 90 years, the Cleveland Torso murders leave us with haunting questions that will likely never be answered. Question 1. How many victims were there really? The official count is 12 in Cleveland, but some investigators believe it could be as high as 20 if you include similar cases in the surrounding years and regions. Bodies might have been disposed of completely, dissolved in chemicals or burned, leaving no trace. Question 2. Where did the murders actually take place? Despite extensive searches, police never found the primary murder site. The killer had to have a private location with running water, drainage, and soundproofing. Somewhere he could work for hours without being disturbed. Several buildings were investigated, including one where Sweeney had access, but nothing was ever conclusively proven. Question 3. What happened to the heads? Only 2 victims' heads were ever recovered. The other 10 heads vanished completely. Did the killer keep them as trophies? Destroy them to prevent identification? Bury them in locations never discovered? Question 4. Why did the murders stop? If Sweeney was the killer, his institutionalization explains the end of the Cleveland murders. But if it was someone else, why stop at the height of the killing spree? Did they die? Move away? Get arrested for something else? Or simply retire satisfied with their work? Question 5. Did the killer ever feel remorse? Serial killers like this typically don't, but we'll never know. Did Sweeney, if it was him, spend those 26 years in the hospital reliving his crimes with satisfaction or haunted by guilt? His actions and letters suggest the former, but the human mind is complex. And the biggest question, could this happen again? In our modern age of cameras and DNA and digital tracking, could a killer operate with such impunity? The answer is sobering, yes. If someone targets the homeless, the addicted, the people society doesn't notice, if they're careful and patient and smart, they could absolutely operate for years without being caught. In fact, they might be doing so right now. Chapter 20. The Cold Case That Won't Die. The Cleveland Torso murders remain one of America's most famous unsolved cases. Books have been written, documentaries filmed, podcasts recorded. Amateur sleuths and professional investigators continue to examine the evidence, hoping to find that one overlooked detail that will finally solve the case. In Cleveland, there's a strange kind of dark tourism around the murders. People visit Kingsbury Run, though it's been completely developed and barely resembles the shantytown of the 1930s. They tour the areas where bodies were found, take photos, speculate about the killer. The case has entered local folklore, becoming part of Cleveland's identity in an uncomfortable way. Some find it ghoulish, this fascination with brutal murders. Others argue it's important to remember, to ensure the victims aren't forgotten, to learn from the investigation's failures. What would Elliot Ness think if he could see the case now? Would he be frustrated that despite all our modern technology, we're still no closer to definitive proof? Or would he be satisfied that people remember, that the investigation continues even decades after his death? The truth is, we'll almost certainly never know who the Cleveland torso murderer was with absolute certainty. Dr. Francis Sweeney is the most likely suspect, but likely isn't the same as proven. The case will remain open, officially unsolved, a reminder that some mysteries resist even our best efforts to solve them. And perhaps that's the final lesson of the Cleveland torso murders. Justice isn't always achievable. Truth isn't always discoverable. Evil sometimes wins, at least in the short term. The great Elliot Ness, the untouchable agent who took down Al Capone, was touched by failure. He was beaten by a killer who understood that in a society that already made certain people invisible, making them disappear forever was terrifyingly easy. 12 victims, at least. 12 people whose lives were stolen, whose bodies were desecrated, whose names in many cases we don't even know. They deserve to be remembered. The case deserves to be studied. And somewhere in the evidence, in the files, in the forgotten details, the truth still waits. Maybe someday someone will find it. Until then, the Cleveland torso murderer remains what he was in life. Invisible, untouchable, and free. If this deep dive into one of history's darkest cases captivated you, please subscribe, give this video a like, and share it with anyone interested in true crime and unsolved mysteries. Leave a comment with your theory about who the killer was. And remember, behind every cold case are real victims who deserve justice, even if that justice takes 100 years to achieve. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next investigation. Imagine this: for 16 years, a single woman terrorized 3 European countries. She left her DNA at 40 different crime scenes. She murdered at least 6 people, including a police officer. She burglarized homes, robbed businesses, and seemed capable of slipping across international borders like a ghost. Police chased her for years. They spent millions of euros. They interviewed thousands of witnesses. They offered a reward of 300,000 euros, nearly $500,000, for any information leading to her capture. They called her the Phantom of Heilbronn. Some knew her as the woman without a face. She was Europe's most wanted criminal, a female serial killer operating at a level few had ever seen. Her crimes spanned from 1993 to 2009, crossing Germany, Austria, and France with apparent ease. Her accomplices were equally diverse and baffling: Slovaks, Serbs, Albanians, Romanians, Iraqis. Men who, when caught and convicted for various crimes, insisted they'd never met her, insisted she didn't exist. No security camera ever captured her image. No witness could describe her face, but her DNA was everywhere, on teacups, cookies, syringes, stolen cars, murder weapons. She was a legend, phantom, the most elusive criminal in modern European history. And then, in March 2009, German police made an announcement that shocked the world. The Phantom of Heilbronn didn't exist. She never had. What police thought was the forensic trail of a prolific female serial killer was actually something far more mundane and far more embarrassing: contamination. Factory contamination. Cotton swab contamination. The most intensive manhunt in German history had been chasing a woman who worked in an Austrian factory packaging medical supplies. A woman who had no idea her DNA was being spread across crime scenes throughout Europe. A woman who was completely innocent. Now, before I tell you how this happened, I need you to think about something. Where are you right now? What city? What country? What time is it where you are? Drop your location and time in the comments. because this story is about how our absolute faith in forensic science can lead us astray, how the tools we trust most can betray us. Subscribe to this channel if you love stories about forensic mysteries and the limits of science. Like this video. Share it with someone who thinks DNA evidence is infallible. Turn on notifications because what I'm about to tell you changed forensic science forever. This is the story of how Europe's most wanted criminal turned out to be a factory worker's shed skin cells. May 25, 1993. Idar-Oberstein, Germany. Lieselot Schlenger was 62 years old. A church warden and pensioner living quietly in a rented apartment. By all accounts, she was kind, religious, and kept to herself. On the evening of May 25th, someone entered her apartment. They strangled her with thin wire, the kind used to tie flower bouquets together. When police arrived, they found Schlenger dead on her floor. No witnesses, no fingerprints, no obvious suspects. It seemed destined to be another unsolved murder. The kind that goes cold, gets filed away, and is eventually forgotten. But investigators collected evidence anyway. They swabbed surfaces looking for DNA. It was still relatively new technology in 1993, but German police were beginning to use it more frequently. One swab came from the rim of a teacup on Schlenger's kitchen table. That swab contained trace amounts of DNA. Just enough to analyze. Just enough to create a genetic profile. The profile was entered into the database and filed away. Nobody thought much about it at the time. DNA from a teacup could belong to anyone. A friend who'd visited, a neighbor who'd stopped by for coffee, even Schlenger herself. But that DNA profile would sit in the database waiting for 8 years, until it appeared again. March 21, 2001. Freiburg, Germany. Joseph Walzenbach, a 61-year-old antiques dealer, was found strangled in his home with garden twine. Like the Schlenger case 8 years earlier, there were no witnesses, no fingerprints, no clear motive. Police collected DNA evidence from the scene, from Walzenbach's possessions, from surfaces the killer might have touched. And when they analyzed it, something extraordinary happened. The DNA matched. Matched what? The DNA from Lieselot Schlenger's teacup. From 1993, 8 years earlier, a completely different city, a completely different victim, same DNA. This meant one thing: the two murders were connected. The same person had been in both apartments, had touched that teacup in 1993 and Walzenbach's possessions in 2001. Investigators were intrigued but cautious. 2 data points weren't enough to call it a pattern. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe the DNA belonged to someone who'd known both victims. Maybe there was a rational explanation. But then the DNA started appearing more frequently. A lot more frequently. Between 2001 and 2009, the same female DNA profile appeared at crime scene after crime scene after crime scene. Burglaries, home invasions, robberies, assaults, murders. The crimes had no obvious connection, no pattern in victim selection, no consistent modus operandi. A stone used to smash a window during a 2006 break-in in Saarbrücken. Phantom DNA. A disused public swimming pool after a burglary in Niederstetten. Phantom DNA. 4 separate home invasions in Quierschied, Thole, and Rial. Phantom DNA at all 4. A syringe found at a drug-related crime scene. Phantom DNA. A cookie at another burglary. Phantom DNA. Inside cars used in various crimes. Phantom DNA. By 2008, investigators had connected this mysterious woman to nearly 40 different crimes across Germany, Austria, and France. The media began covering the case extensively. Who was this woman? How was she evading capture across 3 countries? Why were her crimes so varied and apparently random? Profilers were brought in from across Europe to analyze the pattern. But there was no pattern. That was the problem. The only connection between these crimes was the DNA. Always the same DNA. Always female. Always present. And then, in April 2007, the Phantom committed her most audacious crime yet. A crime that would make her name known across all of Europe. April 25, 2007. Heilbronn, Germany. Two police officers, Michelle Kieswetter, 22, and Martin Arnold, 24, were sitting in their patrol car near a fairground in Heilbronn, eating lunch during their break. At approximately 2 p.m., someone approached the car from behind. Two shots rang out. Both officers were shot in the head at point-blank range. Michelle Kieswetter died instantly. Martin Arnold survived but was critically wounded and fell into a coma. The attack was brazen, execution style, in broad daylight, against police officers. This wasn't a burglary gone wrong or a crime of opportunity. This was targeted, professional. When Arnold eventually woke from his coma weeks later, he had no memory of the attack, couldn't describe the shooter, couldn't explain what had happened. But investigators found something crucial at the scene: DNA, female DNA, the same DNA that had appeared at nearly 40 other crime scenes across Europe. The Phantom had killed a cop. The murder of Michelle Kieswetter changed everything. Before this, the Phantom had been an investigation, a curiosity, puzzle. Now she was a cop killer, and that made it personal for law enforcement across Europe. A special task force was created in Heilbronn called Parkplatz, parking lot, named after where Kieswetter was killed. More than 100 police officers were assigned to the case full-time. The reward was increased, first to 100,000 euros, then 200,000 euros, eventually reaching 300,000 euros. Psychics and fortune-tellers were consulted. Not officially, of course, but some investigators were so desperate they reached out to anyone who might help. Profilers created elaborate theories about who this woman might be. A professional assassin working for organized crime? A mentally ill woman on a crime spree? Multiple women using the same identity? A woman with accomplices who did the actual crimes while she stayed nearby? The theories grew more elaborate as the case dragged on with no breaks, and her list of apparent accomplices continued to baffle investigators. One of the most bizarre aspects of the Phantom case was her supposed accomplices. In several crimes where the Phantom's DNA was found, other people had been caught and convicted. But when asked about the mysterious woman whose DNA appeared at the scene, every single accomplice said the same thing. "I don't know who you're talking about. There was no woman. I worked alone," or "I worked with the people you already arrested." A car dealership robbery. Convicted criminal denied any female accomplice existed. A school break-in, same story. No woman involved. Multiple burglaries where her DNA appeared. The convicted burglars insisted they'd never worked with any woman matching the Phantom's profile. How was this possible? One theory was that the Phantom was so skilled at remaining hidden that even her accomplices never actually saw her. She stayed in the car, coordinated from a distance, never revealed herself. Another theory was that these criminals were protecting her, staying silent out of fear or loyalty. But the simplest explanation, that they were telling the truth and there really was no woman, never seemed to occur to anyone. Because the DNA doesn't lie, right? By 2008, some investigators were starting to have doubts. Not about whether the Phantom existed, the DNA evidence seemed irrefutable, but about whether all these crimes were really connected. The sheer diversity of the crimes was troubling. Murders, burglaries, car thefts, assaults, drug crimes. Serial criminals typically have a pattern, preferred victim type, a consistent method. The Phantom had none of that, and her geographic range was enormous. She'd apparently committed crimes hundreds of kilometers apart within days of each other. Some forensic specialists began quietly suggesting that maybe, just maybe, there was contamination involved, but they were dismissed. How could there be contamination when the DNA appeared at so many different crime scenes, investigated by different police departments, analyzed by different labs? Contamination would have to be systematic, widespread, present in multiple jurisdictions across 3 countries. That seemed impossible. And besides, the DNA profile was so specific, so detailed, clearly came from a real person. So the investigation continued. More resources, more man-hours, more desperation. And then, in early 2009, something strange happened that would finally crack the case open. 2002. A burned body was discovered near the German-French border. The victim was so badly charred that identification was nearly impossible. No face, no identifying marks, no ID on the body. The case sat unsolved for years. In 2009, investigators decided to try again. They had fingerprints from the burned corpse, and they had asylum application records from a male asylum seeker who disappeared in 2002 around the same time and place. They compared the fingerprints from the corpse to the fingerprints from the asylum application. Match. The burned body was the missing asylum seeker, but as part of standard procedure, they also swabbed the asylum application form to collect any DNA that might be present. And when they analyzed that DNA, they got a result that made no sense whatsoever. The DNA from the male asylum seeker's application form belonged to a woman. Not just any woman. The Phantom of Heilbronn. This was impossible. The asylum seeker was definitely male. The fingerprints confirmed it. The records confirmed it. But his application form apparently had the Phantom's DNA on it. Confused investigators decided to retest. They took another swab from the application form, this time using a different cotton swab. And this time, the Phantom's DNA wasn't there. Someone stared at those two results for a long moment. And then they understood. The DNA wasn't on the application form. It was on the cotton swab. Before we continue, I need to check. Are you still with me? What time is it where you are? Where in the world are you listening from? Drop it in the comments. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. Like this video, share it, turn on notifications. Because what comes next is the revelation that brought down one of Europe's biggest criminal investigations and changed forensic science forever. March 26, 2009. German police held a press conference that would shock the nation. They announced that the Phantom of Heilbronn did not exist. There was no female serial killer terrorizing Europe. There was no woman connected to 40 different crimes. There was no mysterious criminal mastermind evading capture for 16 years. There was only contaminated cotton swabs. Here's what had happened. The cotton swabs used by many German and Austrian police departments to collect DNA evidence all came from the same Austrian factory. Grainer Bio 1 International AG. The swabs were sterilized during manufacturing. That sterilization killed bacteria, viruses, and fungi, but it didn't remove human DNA. And at some point during the manufacturing or packaging process, the swabs had been contaminated with DNA from one of the factory workers. A woman who worked at the factory. An innocent woman who had no idea her shed skin cells, her sweat, her saliva, microscopic amounts of biological material, had somehow ended up on cotton swabs that would then be shipped across Europe and used to collect DNA evidence at crime scenes. Every time a police officer used one of these contaminated swabs, they weren't just collecting evidence from the crime scene. They were depositing the factory worker's DNA onto the evidence. The Phantom wasn't bringing her DNA to crime scenes. The police were. To understand how this could happen, you need to understand how cotton swabs are manufactured and how DNA evidence is collected. Cotton swabs, the kind used in forensic investigations, are simple devices. A wooden or plastic stick with cotton wound around the end. The cotton is harvested, processed, wound onto sticks, packaged, sterilized, shipped. At multiple points in this process, human beings handle the materials. They pick the cotton. They operate the machinery. They package the finished swabs. And every human being sheds DNA constantly. Skin cells, hair, sweat, saliva, microscopic amounts that we never notice in daily life but that modern DNA testing can detect with incredible sensitivity. The sterilization process used by manufacturers kills living organisms. But DNA isn't alive. It's just a molecule. Sterilization doesn't destroy it. So these cotton swabs went out labeled as sterile, meaning free of bacteria and viruses. But nobody had ever tested them for human DNA contamination. Why would they? In the 1990s and early 2000s, DNA testing wasn't sensitive enough to pick up trace contamination like this. But by the mid-2000s, DNA technology had advanced dramatically. Tests could now detect DNA from just a few cells, from skin particles invisible to the naked eye. The sensitivity that made DNA testing such a powerful forensic tool had also made it vulnerable to contamination in ways nobody had anticipated. And because all the contaminated swabs came from the same factory, they all had the same woman's DNA on them, creating the illusion of a single criminal appearing at multiple crime scenes. The woman whose DNA created the phantom has never been publicly identified. German and Austrian authorities made a conscious decision not to reveal her name. She was innocent, completely innocent. She'd done nothing wrong except work at a factory. Revealing her identity would serve no purpose except to subject her to unwanted attention, harassment, and possibly worse. What we know about her comes from the mitochondrial DNA analysis that was eventually done. She was of Eastern European descent. The DNA showed characteristics most common in populations from Eastern Europe and neighboring Russia. She worked at the Grainer Bio-1 factory in Austria, which employed several Eastern European women during the relevant time period. She'd been shedding microscopic amounts of biological material onto cotton swabs during the manufacturing process. Not through carelessness, not through malice, just through the normal process of being human. Somewhere in Austria, there's a woman who may or may not know that for 16 years, police across Europe were hunting her DNA signature, that her genetic material was blamed for murders, burglaries, assaults, and robberies, that millions of euros were spent chasing a phantom created by her shed skin cells. She's probably in her 50s or 60s now, maybe still living in Austria. Maybe she moved elsewhere. Maybe she knows. Maybe she doesn't. Either way, she's blameless. The fault lay elsewhere. One detail made the contamination theory even more convincing. Bavaria, the German state immediately south of where many of the phantom's crimes occurred, never found any evidence of the phantom. Not once. In over 16 years. Why? Because Bavarian police bought their cotton swabs from a different supplier. Not Grainer Bio-1, a different factory entirely. So while police in Baden-Württemberg, Hesse, and other German states were finding the phantom's DNA everywhere, Bavarian police found nothing. It was a perfect natural experiment. Same country, same time period, same types of crimes being investigated, but different cotton swabs, and no phantom. This single fact demolished any remaining doubt about the contamination theory. If the phantom were real, why would she avoid Bavaria so completely? Why would she operate extensively just north of the Bavarian border but never cross it? The answer was obvious. She wasn't avoiding Bavaria. Bavaria's police just weren't using contaminated swabs. The revelation that the phantom didn't exist sent shockwaves through European law enforcement. 16 years of investigation. Wasted. An estimated €2 million spent. For nothing. Over 16,000 hours of police overtime. Chasing a ghost. Hundreds of witnesses interviewed. Thousands of tips followed up. Countless man-hours analyzing evidence that was meaningless. And worst of all, real criminals had escaped closer scrutiny because investigators were convinced the phantom was involved. The murder of Michel Kieswetter, the young police officer killed in Heilbronn, that case had to be completely reinvestigated from scratch. The various burglaries, assaults, and robberies where the phantom's DNA appeared, all had to be re-examined without the assumption that a mysterious female accomplice was involved. Some cases were solved once investigators stopped looking for the phantom. Others remained unsolved, but at least now investigators weren't chasing false leads. The embarrassment was immense. German newspapers had a field day. Bild, Germany's largest tabloid, ran the headline, "Are the heads of our police stuffed with cotton wool?" It was brutal, humiliating, and deserved. In 2011, 2 years after the phantom was revealed to be contamination, police finally solved the murder of Michel Kieswetter. The killers weren't a mysterious female serial criminal. They were members of a neo-Nazi terrorist cell called the National Socialist Underground, NSU. The NSU had committed at least 10 murders between 2000 and 2007, mostly targeting immigrants and people of Turkish descent. The murder of Kieswetter didn't fit their usual pattern, which is partly why it had been so hard to solve. But eventually, evidence linked the NSU to her killing.